Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Donald Neilson, the man who would eventually be known to the world as the Black Panther. Imagine, if you will, the northern landscape of England in the early 1970s. It is a place of damp brick, narrow cobbled streets, and the heavy, lingering scent of coal smoke that hangs in the evening mist. The world is transitioning, moving from the swinging 60s into a decade that feels grittier, colder, and more uncertain. In the suburbs of Yorkshire and Lancashire, life follows a predictable rhythm. The orange glow of street lamps flickers to life as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. Most people are retreating into the warmth of their living rooms, the soft hum of the television providing a backdrop to their evening tea. But in the darkness between these pools of light, a figure is moving. He is silent, almost invisible, blending perfectly with the deep blues and blacks of the night. This is not yet the monster of the headlines. This is a man who has spent years perfecting the art of the ghost. He moves with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, his boots barely making a sound on the wet grass. For years, he has been a phantom, a whisper in the ears of the local constabulary who can find no trace of him. Tonight, we begin at the threshold of his transformation, at the moment when a simple burglar decided that the shadows were no longer enough. To understand the man who would wear the dark hood, we must look at the foundation upon which he was built. Donald Neilson was not a man of chaos. He was a man of intense, almost suffocating discipline. Born Donald Nappy, he had changed his name in 1960 to protect his daughter from the cruel teasing he had endured as a child. This act of renaming was his first step in crafting a new identity, one that he could control entirely. His mind had been forged in the crucible of national service. He had served in the military during the 1950s, stationed in the harsh, unforgiving heat of Kenya, the dusty streets of Aden, and the rugged hills of Cyprus. The army did not just teach him how to fight, it taught him how to exist within a system of absolute order. He relished the sharp crease of a uniform, the meticulous cleaning of a rifle, and the strategic planning of a reconnaissance mission. When he returned to civilian life in Bradford, the world felt soft and disorganized. He tried to be a builder, a taxi driver, a man of honest trade, but the mundane reality of ledger books and slow-paying customers grated against his spirit. He felt he was owed more. He began to view the world through a tactical lens, seeing the quiet houses of his neighbors not as homes, but as targets. Between 1965 and 1970, he committed over 400 burglaries. The police called him the Phantom or Handy Andy because of his skill with tools. He would use a woodworking brace and bit to silently drill through window frames, a technique that required patience, steady hands, and a heart of stone. He was a craftsman of the night, but the rewards were small, and his ambition was beginning to ferment into something far more dangerous. By the arrival of 1971, the Phantom was growing restless. The small treasures he found in dresser drawers, silver spoons, a few crumpled pound notes, a gold watch, were no longer sufficient to sustain the life he envisioned. He began to look toward the small hubs of English village life, the sub-post offices. These were places of trust, often run by families who lived above the shop, where the smell of ink, old paper, and stale tobacco filled the air during the day. They were the heart of the community, but to Neilson, they were vulnerable vaults. The shift in his methodology was profound. He began to equip himself for a different kind of war. He traded his simple burglary tools for a sawn-off shotgun, a weapon that offered the ultimate authority. He began to practice his movements with military precision, timing his journeys, studying the layouts of the buildings, and observing the habits of the postmasters from the darkness of the hedgerows. He was no longer just a thief, he was a predator. He understood that to strike these establishments, he would need to confront people directly, and for that, he needed a new face. He crafted a hood, a dark, knitted mask that would swallow his features and turn him into a void. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see Donald the builder or Donald the father. He saw a silhouette. The first of these new raids took place in Nottingham, a tentative step into a more violent realm. He felt the rush of power as he stepped over the threshold, the cold air rushing in behind him. The silence of the post office was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, a sound that seemed to grow louder with every beat of his own heart. The year 1972 brought a deepening of this dark obsession. Neilson had refined his attire, dressing entirely in black, from his heavy wool jumper to his sturdy boots. He was a shadow made flesh. In February of that year, he targeted a sub-post office in Haywood, Lancashire. Picture the scene. The postmaster, a man named Leslie Richardson, and his wife are asleep in the room above the shop. The night is quiet, save for the distant whistle of the wind through the eaves. Suddenly, the silence is shattered. The bedroom door creaks open, and there stands the figure in the dark hood. The moonlight catches the glint of the shotgun barrels. There is a terrifying stillness in the way the intruder moves, no wasted motion, no hesitation. He is like a panther stalking through the undergrowth, poised and lethal. When the struggle began, it was frantic and desperate. Neilson was not expecting resistance, and the violence that erupted in that small, intimate space was a harbinger of the years to come. He managed to escape into the night, leaving behind a family scarred by the encounter, but he had learned a lesson. He realized that the threat of violence was his most effective tool. He began to strike more frequently, moving across the counties of Cheshire and Yorkshire with a speed that baffled the authorities. He would hit one location and then vanish, only to appear weeks later 50 miles away. The police were beginning to realize they weren't dealing with a common criminal, but a man who treated every robbery like a commando raid. They searched for a name to give him, something that captured the sleek, predatory nature of his crimes. But for now, he remained the man in the black hood, a ghost who was slowly turning the peaceful nights of the North into a landscape of fear. As we close this first chapter of our journey, the year is 1973, and the dawn of the Dark Hood is complete. Donald Neilson has successfully bridged the gap between a petty criminal and a master of armed robbery. He has committed 18 raids on sub-post offices, each one a testament to his cold, calculated nature. He lives a double life that is almost impossible to fathom. By day, he is the jobbing builder, the man who fixes the fences and repairs the roofs of the very communities he terrorizes by night. He returns home to his wife and daughter, sitting down to dinner with the same hands that held a shotgun just hours before. The tension within him is like a coiled spring wound tighter with every successful escape. He is meticulous in his domestic life, obsessed with order and cleanliness, perhaps as a way to balance the chaotic darkness of his nighttime excursions. The money he steals is carefully hidden, a growing hoard that serves as his scorecard against a world he believes has failed him. The newspapers are starting to take notice. The reports of the black-clad figure are becoming more frequent, and the word Panther is beginning to circulate in the police stations of the Midlands. The public feels a chill in the air, a sense that the shadows in their own backyards might hold something more than just the night. We leave Donald Neilson here, standing in the dark, his breath misting in the cold air of a Lancashire evening. He is looking at a map, his finger tracing the lines of the roads that lead to his next target. The era of the Black Panther is about to truly begin, and the violence is about to escalate beyond anything the quiet villages of England could ever imagine. Sleep now, if you can, knowing that this story is only just beginning to unfold in the deep, velvet dark. The transition into the year 1974 brought with it a winter that felt particularly heavy, draped in a persistent, damp fog that clung to the stone walls of North Yorkshire. In the town of Harrogate, the nights were governed by a profound, marrow-deep cold. On the 15th of February, the New Park sub-post office stood silent, its windows reflecting the dim, amber glow of the distant street lamps. Inside, Donald Skepper, a man of 58 who had spent his years building a life of quiet service, was asleep. The air in the bedroom was still, smelling faintly of lavender and old wood. But the silence was not empty. It was being meticulously dismantled. A figure, draped entirely in black, moved through the shadows with a fluid, terrifying grace. There was no sound of a footfall on the floorboards, no creak of a hinge. This was the work of a man who had practiced the art of the phantom. When Donald Skepper was suddenly jolted from sleep, he did not see a common thief. He saw a void in the shape of a man, a dark hood erasing all human expression. In a desperate, instinctive surge of courage, Donald rose to protect his home. The intruder did not hesitate. The metallic snap of a pistol discharge tore through the quiet, a sharp, clinical sound that seemed to shatter the very atmosphere. Donald fell, the warmth of his life fading into the cold floor as the intruder dissolved back into the mist, leaving the village of Harrogate to wake to a nightmare that had no face and no name. As the spring of 1974 melted into a restless summer, the police were left grappling with a predator who left no traces. There were no fingerprints on the tarnished brass handles, no fibers caught on the jagged edges of broken glass. The intruder was being spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. It was during this period that a local reporter, struck by the descriptions of the man's lithe, athletic movements and his penchant for all-black tactical gear, posed a question that would define a decade of terror. Where is this Black Panther? The name stuck, blooming like a dark flower in the public consciousness. Donald Neilson, meanwhile, was retreating into the meticulous planning of his next strike. He was a man obsessed with the geometry of his crimes, spending hours studying the rhythmic patterns of small-town life. He watched the way the light changed on the brickwork of post offices across the north, noting the exact second the last patron left and the heavy iron bolts were slid into place. He was not merely a criminal. He was a student of the silence, waiting for the humidity of September to provide the perfect cover for his return to the shadows. By September of 1974, the air had turned thick and stagnant. In the village of Backsenden, near Accrington, the higher Backsenden post office sat nestled against the damp Lancashire hills. On the 6th of September, the moon was obscured by a ceiling of low, grey clouds. Derek Eastbury, the sub-postmaster, was a man who took pride in the security of his establishment, but he was facing an adversary who viewed walls and locks as mere suggestions. The intruder gained entry with the surgical precision of a craftsman, using a brace and bit to silently bypass the defenses. When Derek heard a rhythmic, scraping sound coming from the lower floor, he moved to investigate. The air in the stairwell was cold, smelling of damp wool and stone dust. At the bottom of the steps, the Black Panther waited. The confrontation was immediate and violent. Derek, driven by a fierce sense of duty, lunged at the hooded figure. In the narrow space, a struggle ensued, a frantic collision of shadows. 2 shots were fired, one tore into Derek's shoulder, and another found its mark in his torso. Despite the agony, Derek managed to push the intruder back toward the exit before collapsing. The Panther did not linger to check his work. He vanished into the dark, leaving Derek's family to navigate a house now haunted by the smell of cordite and the crushing weight of a loss that felt entirely senseless. The fear was no longer localized. It was a national contagion. Every sub-postmaster in the country began to look at the shadows in the corner of their shops with a new, sharp suspicion. The police investigation was a massive, sprawling effort, but they were hunting a man who understood the terrain better than they did. Neilson used the canal paths and the wooded thickets of the countryside as his private highways, moving between counties with a calculated invisibility. He was a ghost in a balaclava, a man who had discarded his humanity in favor of a cold, mechanical efficiency. By November of 1974, the darkness had shifted southward, toward the industrial heart of the Midlands. In Langley, near Oldbury, the late autumn rain was constant, a rhythmic drumming on the corrugated metal roofs. The air was metallic, heavy with the scent of wet soot and grease. It was here, at the Langley sub-post office on Junction Road South, that the year's violence would reach its grim crescendo. Sidney Grayland and his wife Margaret were closing another long day of service, unaware that the predator had already marked their door. On the 11th of November, the night was swallowed by a dense, yellow fog. Inside the Graylands' post office, the light was warm and domestic, a stark contrast to the freezing gloom outside. When the intruder broke through the rear entrance, the violence was swifter and more brutal than ever before. Sidney Grayland, aged 55, was confronted in the back of the premises. Without a word, the man in the black hood raised his weapon and fired. Sidney died where he stood, the life leaving him before he could even call out. Margaret, hearing the commotion, rushed toward her husband, only to find herself staring into the empty, black eye holes of a mask. The intruder did not use his gun on her. Instead, he used a blunt, heavy force, striking her down with a ruthlessness that left her with a shattered skull. He rifled through the office, seizing approximately 800 pounds in cash and stamps, before stepping back out into the fog. Margaret lay in the darkness for hours, her breath ragged and shallow, the only witness to a crime that had left her world in ruins. She survived, but the psychological scars were as deep as the physical ones. As 1974 drew to a close, the Black Panther had claimed 3 lives and left a trail of broken families across the map of England. The year ended in a state of high alert, with a nation wondering where the Phantom would strike next, little knowing that his ambitions were about to evolve into something even more terrifying. The fog that had swallowed the post office in 1974 did not truly lift as the calendar turned. Instead, it seemed to harden into a biting, crystalline frost that settled over the village of Highley in January of 1975. The air was so still it felt fragile, like a sheet of thin glass stretched over the Shropshire countryside. In the deep, silent hours of the 14th of January, the village was a collection of shadowed rooftops and slumbering chimneys, unaware that a predator had been watching the rhythm of its life for over a year. He had sat in the darkness, a shadow among shadows, observing a modern, stylish home known as Beechcroft. It was a house of light and success, the home of the Whittle family, whose name was synonymous with the local coach company. But on this night, the house was a target, its edges blurred by the freezing mist and the cruel intent of the man watching from the tree line. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine and the crunch of frost beneath a heavy boot. Donald Neilson moved with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. He reached the side of the house where the telephone wires clung to the brickwork like frozen vines. With a single, sharp motion, he snipped the line. The metallic click was swallowed by the night, but in that instant, Beechcroft was severed from the rest of the world. The house became an island in the dark. He did not rush. He navigated the shadows of the garage, his breath a faint plume of white in the frozen air. The door to the main house yielded with a soft, reluctant groan that would have been invisible to anyone but a ghost. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling of furniture polish and the lingering scent of a family evening. He began his ascent. The stairs were a minefield of potential noise, but he knew exactly where to place his weight to avoid the telltale creaks of timber. Step by slow step, he climbed toward the upper floor, toward the room where 17-year-old Leslie Whittle lay sleeping, her mind filled with the quiet concerns of a college student, oblivious to the man in black standing just beyond her door. The door to Leslie's bedroom opened with the slow, agonizing grace of a nightmare. The room was bathed in the pale, blue light of the winter moon filtering through the curtains. She was so small, barely 5 feet tall, a petite figure tucked beneath the heavy weight of her blankets. The air in the room was peaceful, the only sound the soft, even cadence of her breathing. Then, the peace was shattered by the cold weight of a gun and the terrifying presence of a stranger. There was no time for a scream, no time to process the transformation of her sanctuary into a trap. Neilson worked with the clinical detachment of a machine. He bound her hands, he placed a gag over her mouth to swallow her terror, and he forced a blindfold over her eyes, plunging her world into a sudden, forced midnight. She was led out of her bed, her bare feet touching the cold carpet, clad only in her dressing gown and slippers. The transition was so swift, so total, that it felt like a descent into another dimension. She was steered down the stairs, out through the garage, and into the waiting cavern of a stolen Morris 1100, the car idling like a heartbeat in the frozen driveway. The car pulled away from Hyley, its headlights cutting two lonely paths through the Shropshire mist. Inside, Leslie sat in a void of silence and darkness, the hum of the tires against the road the only indicator that she was being carried 65 miles away from everything she knew. Meanwhile, back at Beechcroft, the house remained deceptively still. The sun began its slow, gray climb over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the empty bedroom. It was Dorothy Whittle who eventually walked toward her daughter's room, perhaps carrying the morning's first thoughts of breakfast and the day's schedule. She pushed the door open, expecting to find the familiar sight of Leslie waking. Instead, she found a bed that had been stripped of its occupant, the blankets tossed aside in a way that screamed of a struggle. The room was cold. The window was a sheet of gray. And there, on the floor, was something that turned the morning air into lead. It was a box of Turkish delight, and tucked near it was a message that had been painstakingly punched out on a long, winding strip of plastic Dymo tape. Dorothy's fingers must have trembled as she reached for the plastic strip. It was over a foot long, the white letters standing out in sharp, mechanical relief against the dark tape. The demand was clear and terrifying, £50,000. The note was not a plea, but a cold command from a man who had already proven he held no value for human life. It warned the family to wait for a telephone call at a shopping center. It carried an ultimatum that chilled the blood. If there were police, or if there were tricks, the result would be death. The cruelty of the message was matched only by the precision with which it had been created. This was not the work of a desperate amateur, but of a man who had planned this moment for 3 long years, who had calculated the worth of a young girl's life in stacks of banknotes. Dorothy stood in the silence of the room, the Dymo tape coiling in her hand like a snake. The realization began to sink in that her daughter was no longer in the house, no longer in the village, but in the hands of a ghost who called himself the Black Panther. The family gathered in a state of suspended animation, the weight of the ransom demand pressing down on them like a physical force. £50,000 was a fortune in 1975, but to the Whittles, it was merely the price of a life they would pay 1,000 times over. They looked at the empty bed, at the severed telephone line, and at the small, mundane objects of Leslie's life, her books, her clothes, which now felt like relics of a lost age. Outside, the world was waking up, unaware of the trauma unfolding within the walls of Beechcroft. The police were notified, despite the kidnapper's warning, sparking a tension that would define the coming days. The instructions were specific. A member of the family was to wait by a public telephone, listening for a voice that would tell them where to go, how to pay, and how to get their daughter back. They did not yet know that the man they were dealing with was a shadow who moved through the darkness of the West Midlands with ease, and that Leslie was currently being held in a place so deep and so dark that the world above could never hear her cry. The air inside the Whittle household had grown thick with the scent of stale tea and the sharp, chemical odor of the red Dymo tape left by the intruder. Every time the telephone rang, the sound seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, rattling the nerves of everyone gathered in the kitchen. Outside, the world of 1975 continued its indifferent march, but within these walls, Time had become a sluggish, suffocating river. The instructions from the man they would come to call the Black Panther were as cold and mechanical as the plastic strips they were printed on. Each letter was a stark, raised white ghost against a crimson background, demanding a sum of £50,000. It was a staggering figure, yet it felt secondary to the simple, agonizing need to hear a voice that wasn't a recording. The family sat in the dim light of the lounge, staring at the telephone as if it were a living thing, waiting for the electronic click that might signal a bridge back to the girl who had been stolen from her own bed in the dead of night. The first step of the journey began at the Swan Shopping Center in Kidderminster. Ronald, Leslie's brother, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned the color of bone. The winter night was a shroud of freezing mist that clung to the windshield, the wipers rhythmic and mournful against the glass. He arrived at the designated phone box, a solitary glass cage glowing under the yellow hum of a street lamp. Inside, he found the next piece of the trail. A tape recorder sat waiting, its black plastic casing slick with the evening's dampness. When he pressed play, the tiny reels spun with a soft, whirring hiss. Then came Leslie's voice. It was thin, trembling, and hauntingly polite. She spoke of being wet, then dry, and of being treated well. To Ronald, the words felt like they were being pulled from a great distance, as if she were already drifting into a different world. The tape gave him new coordinates, leading him further away from the familiar and deeper into the dark heart of Staffordshire, toward a place called Bathpool Park. Bathpool Park was not a place of recreation in the middle of January. It was a rugged, industrial scar on the landscape near Kidsgrove, defined by the hollow echoes of the Harecastle Tunnel and a network of deep, subterranean veins. Beneath the surface lay a labyrinth of drainage systems and ventilation shafts, some reaching down 60 feet into the earth. The locals called the larger openings glory holes, massive concrete throats designed to swallow the overflow of the reservoir. On this night, the park was a theater of shadows. The ground was a treacherous mix of frozen mud and slick, wet leaves that muffled the sound of footsteps. As Ronald drove his car toward the meeting point, he was a stranger in a landscape of hidden dangers. The park felt ancient and indifferent, its silence broken only by the distant, hollow drip of water deep within the stone and the occasional creak of a bare branch in the wind. Somewhere in this darkness, a pair of eyes was watching, waiting for the flash of headlights that would signal the arrival of the £50,000. The plan began to unravel in the silence of the woods. Ronald had become lost on the unfamiliar roads, the turns and signs obscured by the biting January fog. By the time he reached the park, he was 90 minutes behind the kidnapper's schedule. He pulled the car to a halt and began to flash his headlights, the bright beams cutting through the mist like desperate signals from a lighthouse. He stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into his lungs, and called out his sister's name. His voice was swallowed by the trees, returning only as a faint, mocking echo. He walked toward the iron railings of the drainage shafts, peering into the gloom. He had no way of knowing that just feet away, beneath a heavy manhole cover, a ventilation shaft plunged straight down into the dark. He had no way of knowing that his arrival had been observed by a man who was now spooked, retreating into the undergrowth as a police car accidentally cruised past the park's perimeter on a routine patrol. The connection was severed. The money remained in the car, and the silence returned to Bathpool Park, heavier and more terrifying than before. Down in the shaft, the world was reduced to the textures of cold metal and the smell of wet limestone. The descent was a vertical nightmare of rusted iron rungs that bit into the palms. 54 feet below the surface, a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a human to crouch, served as a precarious island in the dark. The walls were slick with condensation that trickled down like icy tears. A wire noose, thin and biting, had been fashioned into a tether, anchored to the heavy pipes that ran the length of the shaft. This was the place where the shadows never lifted, where the only sound was the rhythmic thrumming of the reservoir's water and the scurrying of rats in the deeper tunnels. The air here was thin and smelled of old iron and stagnant dampness. It was a space designed for machinery, not for life, yet it had become a tomb of anticipation. Above, the investigators combed the surface, their flashlights dancing over the grass, oblivious to the fact that the girl they sought was directly beneath their feet, separated from the world by several inches of reinforced concrete and a terrible, yawning silence. The weeks that followed were a blur of missed opportunities and investigative blindness. In the park, a headmaster from a local school would later report that children had found a flashlight wedged in the grills of a shaft, yet the significance of the find would go unrecognized for far too long. A pair of gloves and scraps of dymo tape lay in the grass, slowly being claimed by the winter frost. The police, hampered by a lack of coordination between different regional forces, focused their efforts on the surface, searching the woods and the reservoir banks while the answer lay in the engineering blueprints of the park's drainage system. The investigation was a puzzle with half its pieces missing, scattered across the West Midlands. Every day that passed saw the hope in the Whittle household diminish, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. The echoes in Bathpool Park grew fainter, the trail went cold, and the man in black faded back into the shadows of the industrial towns, leaving behind only the rhythmic drip of water in a deep, dark hole that the world had forgotten to look into. The morning of March 7th, 1975, arrived with a heavy, clinging mist that seemed to swallow the trees of Bathpool Park. For weeks, the ground had been searched, the undergrowth peeled back, and the local reservoirs peered into, but the silence of the park remained unbroken. There was a particular stillness in the air that Friday, a quiet so profound it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The investigation had moved toward the industrial scars of the landscape, focusing on the 3 massive drainage shafts that plunged deep into the Staffordshire soil. These were not mere holes in the ground. They were vertical iron chimneys, capped by heavy, rusted grates that looked like skeletal hands gripping the surface. The police and mine rescue teams moved with a slow, rhythmic determination, their boots crunching on the frost-dusted gravel. They approached the 3rd and final shaft, a dark throat of brick and metal that descended over 50 feet into the subterranean dark. The weight of the iron grate was a physical burden, requiring several men to heave it aside. As it moved, the screech of metal against stone echoed through the woods, a shrill, lonely sound that signaled the end of a long, agonizing mystery. Below them lay a vertical drop, a descent into a world of damp echoes, and the sharp, metallic smell of stagnant water and old iron. Detective Constable Philip Maskery was the first to begin the descent. The ladder was a series of narrow, vertical rungs, slick with condensation and freezing to the touch. Each step down took him further away from the pale morning light, the circular opening above shrinking until it was nothing more than a silver coin against the blackness. 22 feet down, his torchlight flickered across a small brick ledge. There, lying in the dust, was a broken police torch, a relic of a previous, hurried search that had missed the truth by only a few feet. He continued down, the air growing colder, smelling of wet concrete and the faint, sweet rot of autumn leaves trapped in the depths. At 45 feet below the surface, his beam caught the glint of plastic. On a second narrow ledge, no wider than a man's arm, sat a cassette tape recorder. It was a jarring, modern object in such a primitive, dark space. The silence down there was heavy, pressing against his ears. He breathed slowly, the mist of his own breath swirling in the beam of his light. Then, as the light panned further down, past the second ledge and into the final stretch of the shaft, the beam hit something pale. It was a sight that would haunt the dreams of every man present that day. Suspended in the void, 54 feet below the park's surface, was the body of Leslie Whittle. She was found hanging by a length of yellow wire, her emaciated frame appearing fragile and ghost-like in the harsh glare of the torches. She was naked, save for a pendant necklace her boyfriend had given her and 6 silver bangles that still circled her wrist. Her bare feet dangled just 7 inches above the floor of the shaft, a distance so small it felt like a final, cruel joke by her captor. Below her, in the sludge of the shaft floor, lay her slippers. The scene was one of clinical, calculated horror. On the ledge where she had been held, there was a thin mattress, a sleeping bag, and a few magazines. It was a makeshift cell of brick and shadow, a place where time had surely ceased to have meaning. The officers who gathered at the top of the shaft stood in a stunned, mournful circle as the news was radioed up. The search for a missing girl had ended, and the hunt for a monster had begun in earnest. Chief Superintendent Robert Booth, a man who had lived and breathed this case for 52 days, stood by the opening of the shaft and made a silent, solemn vow. The weight of the failure to find her alive was heavy on his shoulders, but it was replaced by a cold, burning resolve. He told the gathered press that he would catch this callous killer if it was the last thing he ever did. The forensic investigation that followed was a painstaking reconstruction of Leslie's final moments. The pathologist discovered that she had not died from a slow, agonizing strangulation, but from something known as vagal inhibition. It was a term that sounded clinical, yet it described a terrifyingly sudden end. The pressure of the wire against her neck, combined with the sudden shock of a fall from the ledge, had sent a frantic signal to her brain, causing her heart to simply stop beating. She had died in an instant of pure, unadulterated terror. The medical team estimated her death had occurred around January 17th, only days after she was snatched from her home. This meant that for nearly 7 weeks, the police had been chasing a phantom, searching for a girl who was already gone. Her body was emaciated, weighing only 44 kilograms, suggesting she had been starved during those final, dark days. The news sent a wave of revulsion across Britain. The details of her captivity, the wire noose, the freezing drainage shaft, the lonely darkness, turned the faceless kidnapper into a figure of national nightmare. The name Black Panther was no longer just a headline about post office robberies. It became synonymous with a predatory, calculated evil that had successfully evaded the combined might of 4 separate police forces. A nationwide manhunt was unleashed, the largest the country had seen in decades. Over 400 officers worked around the clock, sifted through thousands of statements, and followed every lead, no matter how faint. The profile of the killer began to take shape. He was disciplined, knowledgeable about the landscape, and possessed a chilling level of technical skill. He was a man who moved through the shadows with the confidence of a soldier, leaving behind only small, cryptic clues like dimetape labels and carefully recorded cassette tapes. Public fear peaked as the realization set in that the Black Panther was still out there, somewhere in the rolling hills of the Midlands or the cramped streets of the northern towns. Every man in a dark jacket became a suspect. Every shadow in a doorway was a cause for alarm. The pressure on the police was immense, as they were criticized for the botched ransom drops and the missed opportunities in the park. But as spring turned to summer, and summer faded into a cold, biting autumn, the trail seemed to go cold. The killer had vanished back into his ordinary life, perhaps watching the news with the same detached, cold curiosity he had shown his victim. He believed he was invisible, a master of the night who had outplayed the law. He did not know that his own arrogance would eventually be his undoing, or that the memory of a 17-year-old girl in a dark shaft would eventually lead the world to his door. The air in Mansfield on the night of December 11th, 1975, was a thick, damp curtain of winter chill. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the wool of a heavy coat and settle deep within the bone. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the rhythmic amber pulse of street lamps casting long, flickering shadows against the brickwork of the sub-post office. Inside a small police patrol car, Officers Stuart Mackenzie and Tony White sat in a pocket of warmth, the soft hum of the engine providing a low, mechanical lullaby against the silence of the residential estate. The windows were beginning to fog slightly from their breath, a delicate mist that obscured the outside world until they noticed a figure moving through the gloom. It was a man, solitary and rhythmic in his stride, draped in dark clothing and carrying a heavy hold doll that seemed to pull at his shoulder. There was something about the way he moved, a careful, calculated precision that didn't quite sit right with the late hour. A copper's instinct, sharpened by years of observing the small irregularities of human behavior, stirred in the quiet of the cabin. They decided to pull over, the tires crunching softly on the grit and frost, unaware that they were about to come face to face with the most hunted man in the country. When the window was rolled down, the bite of the December air rushed in, smelling of wet pavement and distant coal smoke. The man stopped. He gave a name that was later found to be a lie, his voice steady but his eyes darting like a cornered animal. In a heartbeat, the mundane reality of a routine stop shattered. A sawn-off shotgun, cold and heavy, was suddenly leveled at the officers. The metallic click of the hammers being pulled back echoed in the small space of the car, a sound that felt as loud as a thunderclap in the stillness. He forced his way into the vehicle, the scent of oil and old metal filling the cramped interior. The journey that followed was a nightmare of whispered threats and the heavy weight of the barrel pressed against ribs. They drove slowly, the car gliding like a ghost through the sleeping streets of Rainworth. But as they neared a fish and chip shop known as the Junction, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of hot grease, salt, and vinegar wafted through the vents, a surreal contrast to the life-and-death struggle happening in the front seat. Sensing a fleeting moment of hesitation, Officer Mackenzie slammed his foot onto the brake with all his might. The car screeched, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the vehicle bucked and skidded to a violent halt. In the chaos that followed, the silence of the night was replaced by the sound of glass shattering and the desperate, guttural grunts of men fighting for survival. The capture was not a clean, cinematic moment, but a frantic and messy struggle on the cold ground outside the chip shop. The light from the shop's window spilled out onto the pavement, illuminating the scuffle in stark, yellow highlights. Bystanders, their dinners forgotten in their hands, rushed forward to help. The man who had terrorized the country, the one who had moved like a shadow through the woods and drainage pipes, was finally held fast against the concrete. When the police eventually pulled him away, his face was bruised, his dark clothes stained with the grime of the gutter. Back at the station, the mask truly began to slip. They found his home in Bradford to be a place of meticulous, chilling organization, filled with maps, tools, and the remnants of his dark voyages. The trial, held in the sweltering heat of the summer of 1976 at Oxford Crown Court, was a somber affair. The courtroom was a grand space of polished oak and heavy drapes, yet it felt suffocatingly small as the evidence was laid out piece by piece. The families of the sub-postmasters and the loved ones of young Leslie Whittle sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a grief that no verdict could truly soothe. Neilson sat in the dock, his expression a mask of indifference, even as the details of the drainage shaft and the wire tether were described in agonizing, sensory detail. The jury did not take long. The weight of his crimes was a mountain that could not be moved. He was sentenced to 5 life terms, with the judge recommending that he should never again breathe the air of the free world. The years that followed were a long, slow descent into the gray silence of the prison system. Decades passed. The world outside changed, the technology of the 70s giving way to a digital age he would never know. Inside the high walls, the man who once called himself the Panther grew old and frail. The strength he had once prized, the physical prowess he had used to climb into the rafters and scale the walls of post offices, began to wither. In his final years, he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, a condition that slowly stole the movement from his limbs, leaving him a prisoner within his own body. By December 2011, 36 years after his capture in the cold streets of Mansfield, he was taken to a hospital in Norwich. There, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic and the soft, rhythmic beeping of medical monitors, Donald Neilson passed away at the age of 75. His death was a quiet ending to a story that had begun with such violence and noise. The headlines flared one last time, reminding the public of the fear he had once inspired, before fading back into the archives of history. Today, the locations that once held such terror have returned to the rhythm of the everyday. Bathpool Park is a place of birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the drainage shaft now capped and hidden away, a secret kept by the earth itself. The sub-post offices, those small hubs of community, continue their quiet work, though the memory of the mid-70s remains a shadow in the corner of the local memory. We remember the victims, not the shadow that pursued them. We remember the brightness of Leslie, the dedication of the postmasters, and the bravery of those who finally brought the long hunt to an end. The story of the Black Panther is a reminder of the darkness that can hide in the most ordinary of places, but also of the light that eventually finds its way into the deepest tunnels. The wind outside your window now is just a gentle sigh, the house is settled, and the world is at peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.